Okay, it looks like it's not giving me the opportunity for me to have both the chat and the screen up at the same time, so I'm going to have to pop to the chat at the end rather than answering questions as we go along. Let's see. It is 7:04, and I think the number of new people popping in is slowing down. So, or maybe not. I don't know if y'all can hear the little ding dongs or not. So my name is Joan Mullinax, and I'm with Edens Counseling Group. And I focus on personal growth and development and career development. So I spend a lot of time working with people on developing healthy boundaries. So logistically, we've got everybody set up on mute. So if you're confused or have a question, send me a question on the chat box. I'm not seeing how to make the chat box show up at the same time as the rest of the screen, so I'll probably have to get to that at the end. The session's also being recorded for use on our website, so you probably want to turn off your videos. Unfortunately, this means that I will be limited in the visual feedback I'm getting on what I'm saying, so if I can figure out still how to get the chat up, I'd really like to do that, because I would somebody pop in and make faces at me if you're not getting it, okay? That would be very helpful. Talking to people where you can't see their faces is a bit of a challenge. Okay, so this talk is going to take about 45 minutes. Oh, we got a thumbs up. Great. Okay, thank you, Meredith. It's going to take about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time to something popped up here. More chat. No, it's not letting me do that. Okay. All right. So any questions about the logistics? Send me a thumbs down, I guess. But even I can't see everybody. I can see only just a small number. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about is healthy boundaries in relationships. And I found this lovely picture in the Bubble Soccer website. And this is as close as I could come to a visual description of boundaries. So boundaries are invisible, they're symbolic, and they are, we're going to put in quotation marks, force fields. And one of the things I want to say up front that's extremely important, and that I will probably reiterate throughout the presentation, is that we have a right to establish our boundaries. And we're going to talk a whole lot more about how to do that. So if you can imagine these kids, you could translate them into your nearest grocery store during COVID, and the bubbles being invisible, and watching the human beings kind of do this dance around and try to stay 6 feet away from each other mostly. And so that's one of the places we're seeing boundaries very actively exercised, and in some cases violated these days. So, I'm going to provide you some information about boundaries, what they are, what purpose they serve, and about healthy and unhealthy boundaries. And because I'd like to make this a practical use to you, as I speak, you might think about examples in which you have struggled to have healthy boundaries in a relationship. And I'm going to give you a tool or framework that you can use to have healthy conversations about setting boundaries, healthy both for others and for yourself. So if you kind of have somebody in mind that you'd like to talk to about the boundary, about a boundary violation, you might hold that in mind as we discuss this topic. And I apologize, somebody is knocking at my front door. Welcome to Modern Times. I'm on a video right now during the presentation. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so now let's get back this back in front of me. Okay, so let's just test about our experience with boundaries. Okay, so have you ever had an experience where there was somebody who stood too close to you, or somebody who touched your property without your permission? I can think about an engineer that I worked with years and years ago, and I always felt uncomfortable around him, and I couldn't figure out for the longest time why. And then I realized he was always just a little too close to me for my comfort. And, you know, being a software engineer at the time, I didn't have any real tools to talk about boundaries and say, can you step back, please? Okay, so what that means when you have that sense of somebody being too close or somebody touching your personal property that you haven't given permission to, that means your boundaries are being violated. Okay, and you can often feel it. So some people feel it like energy, like two magnets, that you've got the same pole going toward each other where they're pushing against each other. If anybody's ever studied any Chinese martial arts, Tai Chi, Qigong, you know about Qi balls and feeling the energy potentially between your hands and things like that. Now, not everybody's going to experience it as a sensation, but you're going to at least experience it if you have boundaries as a push or a violation or a discomfort. Okay, so let's talk about the purpose of boundaries. So if you're going to talk about boundaries these days, one of the key people that you're going to refer to is Pia Mellody. And I had the pleasure of sitting in on a presentation that Pia Mellody did in Houston several years ago, and she gave us some very technical terminology to talk about the purposes of boundaries. And what she told us was that they were to protect ourselves from other people's hoo-ha and to protect others from our hoo-ha. And I'll let you fill in the blank as to what she might mean by hoo-ha, but I found that very helpful. They also are useful for defining what's me and what's not me. So not all of us have a real clear picture where we end and where someone else begins. If you watch a young child discovering their body and they grab a hold of their toes, they have this real sense of, oh, that's me. And they didn't know it until they grabbed their toes. So we're going to be talking more about that. Pia obviously is a bit of a character. So let's start by talking about types of boundaries. Now you can go into this subject at a much greater depth than I'm going into it today. I'm going to try to give you some fundamental concepts, and I'm going to give you a practical exercise that you can begin to use in your own life. And if you're a therapist, you can begin to use with your clients. This is an exercise that Pia Mellody created called the talking boundary. So the types of boundaries that we have are external and internal. And the external boundaries are physical boundaries and sexual boundaries. And then we'll go a little bit deeper talking about each of those. So physical has to do with how close someone is allowed to get to you, okay? And whether they can touch your personal property or not. Now, obviously this varies dramatically depending on who the person is and the circumstances that you're in, but you probably have encountered some people at certain times in your life, like the girlfriend who borrowed your sweater and brought it home smelling like alcohol and tobacco. That was a boundary violation. So she had permission to wear the sweater, but not to bring it back like that. Oops, sorry, I double clicked. Okay, so sexual boundaries. So sexual boundaries have to do with sexual distance, sexual touch, with whom you will be sexual, where you will be sexual, and how you will be sexual. So when you think about the with whom, it's has this person gained my trust, or am I taking risks here? Or is this someone that I deeply trust and they are welcome to approach me sexually, and frequently they also welcome my approach sexually? The where can be anywhere from your bedroom with the doors closed and the kids in the other room. It can be your bedroom on date night. The kids are at your parents' house. The door doesn't have to be closed, and you don't have to worry about if you're getting a little too frisky when you're being sexual. The other thing is, how are you being sexual? So there are, just take a glance at the Kama Sutra and you'll get a sense of how many different ways there are to be sexual, and you will be comfortable with some of them and not comfortable with others. And so it's very important that you you recognize where you're comfortable, where you're distinctly uncomfortable, and where you might be willing to experiment. So those are all things that could come up in dealing with the external sexual boundaries. Internal boundaries are a little trickier, and I'm going to talk about them more later when we get more specific into the example. So it's to protect our behavior, feeling, and thinking from others. So this is others not controlling our behavior, others not trying to tell us that we don't have the feelings that we have, others attacking our thoughts. But it's also to protect others from our behavior. So for example, tone of voice or word choice. It also is to protect others from our feelings. So when we start talking about the talking boundary, one of the things we're going to talk about is, how does one talk to another person about one's feelings when they're having what may be a challenging conversations. Also, it protects others from our thinking. And there's some people, if you try to talk politics right now, this is a good place for setting boundaries, is because there's not civil conversations happening between people with opposing points of view. Okay, so the boundary status can be in a variety of states, and the state that your boundary's in can vary dramatically depending on who you're around. And I'll go into more detail on this. So your boundaries can be intact. This is the healthiest boundaries that you can have because it gives you the most flexibility. They can be non-existent. You don't even know what they mean. When somebody first introduced me to the concept of boundaries, I must have had the blankest look on my face, because my mother considered the boundaries in my family of origin as going from wall to wall, including piercing the individual being of all the other 6 people who were occupying the household. And she saw no problem at all with that. And it took me a long time to figure out that that was a problem. Okay. Boundaries can also be damaged. I won't talk about that as much in detail. Walls, you can have walls instead of boundaries. And then you can also vacillate from walls to non-existent. Okay. So here's some pictures, and if we have any gentlemen, I apologize for the fact that we only have ladies. I was using a drawing tool that I was having challenges with, and rather than try to work with gender, I decided to get all my pictures in. So intact boundaries provide protection and they allow for vulnerability and intimacy. So in this picture, you can see right now, this person has her boundaries out to here. If she were with somebody that she was very close to, she may let these boundaries in and let them get closer to her. This person has non-existent boundaries. So they have no protection from other people's abuses or even opinions. And sometimes they have no sense of being abused or of abusing. They don't realize that their actions are potentially abusive to others because they have non-existent boundaries. Moms learning to have adult children are great examples of experiments with transitions from non-existent boundaries to intact boundaries. Okay, walls provide complete protection, so you'll notice we got a much thicker surface here, but they provide no intimacy. Now, one of the things that Pia Melody talks about is she talks about the external boundary, and she talks about it like an external shell or a bell jar that keeps things away from you. And I had this lovely accident on my picture where she says, your internal boundaries are more like a flak jacket that fits a little closer and you decide what to open up and what not to open up. So I got some accidental internal boundaries here on the folks with boundaries and not with the folks that don't have boundaries. So now where do boundaries come from? And I've already dropped some hints about this. So they're taught by our primary caregivers. And I think primary caregivers plural is a good approach because it varies substantially. You might have one parent who has reasonable sense of boundaries and another who has no sense of boundaries at all. You may have one parent that has walls. You may have one parent that's inconsistent. Sometimes they're available, sometimes they're not available. So you're taught about things like beliefs, like, do you have the right to have boundaries? Do you have the right to say, this is my body, you can touch it or not touch it, you can touch it this way or not touch it. People with siblings get lots of opportunities to practice their boundaries because siblings are really great at pushing the limits on those things. Feelings. Which feelings are welcome, which are not welcome. So we learn to silence the ones that are not welcome and be more expressive in the ones that are. Behavior, what is allowed and what's not allowed. Now, there's a healthy aspect of this in the sense of protecting you before you know how to protect yourself. Also protecting others from you, like protecting your siblings from you when you get mad. And so, but there are also instances in which behavior that you're taught is not allowed. When you become an adult, you may discover that there are behaviors that are allowed that were blocked for you before. You may have been gracefully taught that these are private and not evil, which makes it a little bit easier whenever you start to emerge as a sexual being. So okay, so let me go back. So let's see if I can see. Let me see if I can shrink this down and see if I can get the chat box in front of me and see if there's been any questions that come in. Okay. Obviously, I need to learn more about using this tool. Okay, it doesn't have. Okay. Chat box is in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen and you can leave it up for the duration. Yes, I'd found that at one point and it's not there anymore. So thank you very much, Leslie. Um, I'll get rid of what I've got here and see if I can keep an eye out for it. Oh, I think I may have, nope, that's a picture of one from another screen. So, all right, so that was the only question that we had on the chat. So we'll go back to our presentation. And let's see, how do I want to do this? Nope. That can go away. Okay. No, I don't want a new share. Some thoughtful person is giving me helpful information. Healthy boundaries, here we go. Okay, there we go. All right, back to slideshow. I tell you, it's been a long time since I've done a slide presentation. All right, when in doubt, go to slide 10. Okay, so let me shrink that down a little more. Okay. So now let's get into the talking boundary. So usually this is where you're going to have a conversation with somebody on something that is an issue. So it may not be something that's easy to talk about. So one of the things I'm going to encourage you to do is, as you begin to practice the talking boundary, that you start in low stakes situations. You know, maybe tell your server that your steak is too done. Something like that, rather than starting with your intimate partner and, you know, on some long-standing issue. All right, so the purpose is to discuss an issue with someone, and I think it's very important to get the mindset that's associated with the talking boundary. So normally, if I were in my office, I would be standing up about now, and I would be saying, I'm standing solidly on my own 2 feet. I'm neither leaning forward to the other person, being aggressive with them, nor am I leaning away, being passive or avoidant. I recognize that I have a right to my experience. My experience is allowed, and it is not something that someone else can take away with me. On the other side of that coin, I'm responsible for my own thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So, you know how easy it is when you're having a difficult conversation and we say, you make me so mad, or you hurt my feelings, or, you know, whatever it is, you make me feel X, okay? And as you develop some sense of healthy boundaries, you begin to go, that is not about me. That is not about that is not about me. That is about them. What I think is what I think, and I'm entitled to what I think. And in fact, I own what I think. Okay. As we get into this, we're going to talk about using I statements. You statements tend to come across as accusing. So I'm going to point my finger at you, and I want you to see how that feels when I point my finger at you. Usually it feels pretty uncomfortable just even in a relatively neutral setting then like this, where somebody points their finger at you as if they're making an accusation. Okay. So we're going to start at just the basic framework of the talking boundary. So we're going to start with sensory data, something you can see, smell, taste, feel, or hear. Okay? Now, we also know that we have some other senses that hadn't been counted previously. So we have our interoception, where we can tell what's going on inside of our body, where our body is oriented in space, things like that. And we also are very deeply social and have, like at the cellular level, and have well-defined brain structures for reading human faces. So sometimes the sensory data may be something that you have to go a little bit beyond the five senses, or you can say, when I see your nose squinch up like that, I think. Okay, so you're still trying to go for the sensory data. Then we're going to go for the thoughts that the sensory data brings into your mind. Okay. Then we'll go for the emotions that you feel, and that can be triggered by the thoughts that you have or colored by the thoughts that you have. It can also be colored by your experiences from the past. And then the last part of the talking boundary is we're going to make a request for future behavior. So let's go into this into more detail. Okay, so on the sensory data, we're talking about observable behavior. So not when you yelled at me, but when your voice got louder. It's like if a Martian were observing this, it would say, yes, in fact, the voice got louder. Martian would say, I don't know what yell means. Okay. And it also is a very loaded word. And this is where we begin to exercise our internal boundaries by choosing our words very carefully about what we say. So, we might have the inclination to say, when you turned your back on me, and we might even throw a little body English into it. And so that's when our internal boundaries are starting to kind of bump out against the other person. So we might say instead something about, when you turned away from me, when I heard you say, I don't want to talk right now. So it's sensory data. Okay. I'm going to walk you through a personal example on this with my significant other. And so the sensory data is when you turned away from me when I said something to you. So he turned away as I was saying something to him. Notice nothing more than that. He didn't turn his back on me. He didn't stomp out of the room, or any of those other lovely loaded phrases that we like to use. We're sensory data. Okay. Then we're going to talk about our thoughts. Okay. And so sometimes this language feels a little bit artificial when you start out. And in fact, sometimes even the people that we start using the talking boundary with will begin to heckle us about I statements, I and I statements. And so you'll have to have some tolerance about that. It's one of the reasons I recommend that you start in low stakes situations. Plus, your language will get more fluent as you practice. So I thought, what I made up was, what was triggered from my past was, in my particular case, I assumed you didn't care about what I had to say. I assumed that. So I'm owning the fact that I made an assumption, okay? Then the emotions, I felt. That thought triggered the feeling that. So this, once again, the person did not make you feel this way. It's important to own your own feelings. They often arise from our thoughts and from what we've experienced in the past. So in my example of talking to my significant other, I say, I felt dismissed and hurt. Those are my feelings. I'm entitled to those feelings. He can say you shouldn't have felt that way. But when we come to the vulnerable request, you'll see that I haven't made any assumptions about how he's treating me from the sensory events that I observe. Okay? So in the future, what I'd prefer is, what I'd like is, and in my case, I would appreciate it if you would have your hearing checked and consider getting hearing aids. I happen to know this man has hearing problems and they are untreated. So I'm beginning to recognize when he is just not hearing me and when he doesn't want to hear me. Those are two different things. So the other person may accept your request. They may decline your request. They may make a counter offer to your request. If you own your own experience and a person consistently declines your request, that's really useful information that you want to pay attention to, because you have just made a vulnerable request about your needs. You have been very responsible about maintaining your internal boundaries and not attacking this person, and yet they're saying, nope, not going to do that. And especially if they're saying, nope, not going to do that, where it's kind of, let's see, what would the Martian say? Well, it was a negative, so they declined your request. And the brief, not going to do that, sounded a little bit cut. Okay. So remember, you're responsible for your thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. You're responsible for your own well-being, and you have choices. So if you begin to discover that you're in a relationship with someone who consistently declines your reasonable, vulnerable requests, you may have some choices to make. Now, for some people, that means taking this challenging question into, the safe environment of couples therapy. For some people, couples therapy is not an option, and then they can talk to a couple that does a person who does relationships counseling, but they work primarily with one individual, and that individual then practices in real life. So, but if you think of a relationships as like a mogul that has a certain balance, if one person shifts, it's impossible for the balance in the relational dynamic not to shift. And I will tell you that I have been stunningly surprised as I've begun to use this style of communication at the difference between the response I expected to get and the one I actually got. So I'm finding that people are much more open to what I have to say and are much more likely to either respond in the affirmative or come up with a counteroffer that we can both agree to. So, so you've had a little time to look at this. Let me tell you a bit about the resources that I drew this from. One was the classic of Pia Melody with Andrea Wells and J. Keith Miller, Facing Codependence, what it is, where it comes from, how it sabotages our lives. So the little boundary drawings came from that, because codependents tend to have boundary injuries. Melody Beatty, so I don't know why everybody who does codependency is named Melody or something, but Beyond Codependency and Getting Better All the Time. So I think this is a subsequent book from her first book, just Beyond Codependency. And then if you really want to dig deeper into this, get a hold of The Intimacy Factor, The Ground Rules for Overcoming the Obstacles to Truth, Respect, and Long-Lasting Love. I'm sorry, I missed a typo. I did some pretty serious proofreading, but I blew that one. So that's Pia Melody and Lawrence Freundlich. So now let's see what we do here. Stop the share. Yes. Now I have chat. Now I can see questions. Okay. All right. So let's see. Is there a way to let her, please advance the slide. Okay. So you should have gotten copies of the slides with the confirmation for the presentation. And some of the slides, I started with one topic at a shallow level, and then I took it down to the next level and went deeper. So it may have, in some cases, I may have sneaked into the deeper slide while I still had the less detailed slide up. So I apologized if I could to do that. So, okay, so I got unmute, maybe I can hear you. That's good. I'm glad to hear that since I've been talking for a while. Okay, somebody says I'm following along on the notes that were in the email, and somebody else says I'm trying to do that as well. So any questions? If you unmute and give a question, it will go on the recording. If you would prefer to have me just read the question, you can send it in on the chat. So y'all are all ready to take this out into your lives and test drive it on your intimate others? Or you're ready to put your toe in the water and begin to try it out in lower stakes situations? You think it's a bunch of hogwash and you don't see it as being useful at all? All inputs are welcome, though I would appreciate the if you have a strong opinion that is inconsistent with what I've been saying, then there are boundaried ways to present that information. Okay, great, thank you. Thank you, Tricia, I appreciate that. So I got a little positive feedback and I appreciate that. Like I said, it's a little challenging doing a presentation whenever you can't see the faces of the people you're talking to. Very helpful information. I'll definitely be checking out Pia Melody. Yes. Are there activities that you would specifically use when one party is resistant? Okay. This sounds like we've got couples counselors on board. Somebody said that this reminds them of things that they have encountered before. Resistance has come up again. Okay. So sometimes you will come up with resistance from the person who is trying to use the talking boundary. And this can be for a variety of reasons. For some of them, if they have lived an unboundaried life, the ability to begin to establish boundaries can be terrifying to them. So you have to start really slow with them. You may even ask them to practice with you if you've gotten a good relationship, if you've worked with them long enough to have a good relationship with them. You suggest that they start in very safe situations, people that they're never going to see again. If they want to, they can practice on the dog. Dogs are pretty easy and are very, they're not necessarily going to give you the answers that you want, but they will allow you to say out loud what you need to say without your getting any pushback. Dogs and cats, your critter friend. So one is working with the person who is trying to develop their ability, their boundaries, healthy boundaries, and their ability to communicate with someone in a boundaried way. Then on the other side of the coin is, say you're in a couple situation and there's someone who's not willing to play. Okay. Sometimes I think that's a good time to ask the person what their purpose is in being there. Now, you wouldn't want to laugh about it, but in some cases, that is a useful question to ask somebody. What brings you into couples counseling? What are you hoping to accomplish? Why are you here today? How can I be of assistance to you today? What are your concerns about this approach? Is there some request that you would like to make of your partner that would make it easier for you to listen to what they have to say? Oh, lovely. I have a dear friend who has a husband who has a bad temper and believes he's never wrong. He's a bit of a bully, and I've noticed he isn't open to negotiation. It isn't an option to stop seeing her, so I'm curious as to how best to deal with the situation. So one is you would hope that your friend would be open to being encouraged to see a therapist on her own. The other thing is find a safe environment in which to carry on your conversations with your friend. Hopefully there's an opportunity to safely have coffee or even sit on the patio if the husband is sufficiently rigid that even the wife's having a conversation with you is problematic. So you make your conversation nice and visible, but preferably not audible, and give that a try and see if it works. This is a tough one. This is a tough one. So let's try this methodology on if this were your friend or your spouse. How would you approach them with this methodology? So the husband has a bad temper. So if the Martian were watching, what would the Martian see? Would he be raising the volume of his voice? Would he be making judgmental statements about his wife? What is his, how does his bad temper show up? Is he physically abusive or physically threatening? Is he financially abusive or financially threatening? So if this was a person that you needed to talk to, how would you go about talking to this person? It's going to have to be very carefully because they've got walls up. This is a person with walls up, and it's going to take time. You know, this is a wall of anger. And it makes walls make people safe, but they also keep them from having deep relationships with people. So if this is a person that wants to have a deep relationship with his wife, he may want to start listening to her if that matters to him. If it doesn't matter to him, then that's useful for her to know. And a great comment. That is a tough one. Hopefully, she won't eventually become discouraged and lose confidence in the therapeutic process. Yes. So, how long has this been going on? Probably for years. It's not going to be fixed overnight. And so people have to sometimes be reminded that therapists do not come in waving magic wands that make things suddenly better, that it requires work and it requires time. And you hope that the person will stick with the process long enough to actually begin to break some of the barriers down. We hope that she will at least stay in therapy so she can work on her own boundary skills and begin to use them in her relationship and see if he is capable of making more positive responses to that. Anyone else? If anybody wants to unmute that has insights on dealing with resistance, that seems to be a recurring question. But like I said, it goes on the recording if you unmute yourself. Okay. So I just got something that's anonymous. And I don't know if this one is intended to be shared, but it's on the it's on the it's on the chat. I don't know. Do y'all see the chat? Book study, so psychoeducation can be extremely useful. Um, Good resource for couples is EFT, a book like Sue Johnson's Hold Me Tight, because she got into the notion of the reason that people get into these life and death struggles in their intimate relationships is because they're dealing with attachment issues. That as adults, our primary attachment issue is with our intimate other, and that when we experience a breach in the attachment bond, our nervous system experiences it as if it's a life-threatening experience. So amygdala comes in first, neocortex it gets the news later. So, all right, got another question. How do you apply boundaries in a workplace setting? Very carefully. Hopefully you will find that there is leadership that supports setting appropriate boundaries. Sometimes it's the leadership that needs boundaries set with them, and that can be particularly challenging. Sometimes you can find allies above the leader who's the problem. Sometimes you can't. And sometimes in jobs, if it turns out that it's a toxic environment and it's not going to change, then you may want to look for a healthier environment, because I work with a lot of people on getting them out of toxic environments, and there are better and worse work environments. Okay, a dilemma. Okay, We got a boyfriend that's a people-pleasing type who's always struggled with setting boundaries with people. So I keep finding out months after the fact that I have him, uh, I've, I think, encroached upon a boundary, and I didn't even know he had. How can I encourage him to open up and tell me something in the moment rather than later? I feel like every time we discuss it, the conversation doesn't really go anywhere. So, um, work can be done in therapy on this. In your work with him individually, you're going to want to use every bit of your social skills. Your brain is very good at reading facial expressions and body language. Try to begin to notice when the no happened, when the I prefer not to happened, but didn't get verbalized. You may start to get subtle hints that you can pick up on that you can then ask about at the time. Like, it seems to me like you might have preferred to have Italian rather than Chinese tonight. And, he may say, no, 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 it's fine either way. Either way is fine with me. And it's like, but you turn your head to the side as if maybe you weren't so sure. And I'm wondering whether that was true or not, or if this is just what, I'm imagining things. So it's paying very close attention and encouraging, engaging in and encouraging people to participate in therapy, and then doing very read the books that go into more detail on this. Actually, the intimacy factor might be a very useful one in that situation, because you've got a relationship that there are some things working about and that there's some things that aren't. That might be a useful tool to begin working on that. Okay, it's 7:56. Anybody else have questions or comments? Okay, and all right. So that's what I had for today. If you have any questions that come up later, you are welcome to email me. I'm Joan at Eddins, EDDINS, counseling.com. And if I don't have the answer, I have colleagues who will, and we'd be happy to be of service to you in any way that we can. Anything else? I see a potential for a chat, but no message. So maybe this is somebody who wants to talk once we go off screen. So anybody else? Okay. All right. So if you have, if you're satisfied with what we've covered so far, you're quite welcome. It was my pleasure. I learned a lot while I was doing this, and it always reminds me. It reminds me that I need to behave myself. So please do remember to, I know I've got something I've got to do. I have to give you the it's also in your email, the link for doing the Control V. There, I just put in the chat the link for doing the evaluation. So I'd appreciate your completing the evaluation. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate such a great turnout and such good questions. You were really, I wish I could have seen your faces. It would have been a delight. Maybe we will cross paths in the future. Is there a link for the replay? It will be showing up on our website. It might be after some editing is done. I don't know whether they put them up raw or not. So Eddins Counseling, EDDINS.com. And you'll have to kind of shop around under the different links there because I don't know exactly. They just recently rearranged the website and I don't know quite as well where things are as I did a month ago. All right, thank you all for coming. I always hate to shut things down because it's like I know there are human beings on the other side of this and I don't like to hang up on you. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close now. It looks like everybody has said what they needed to say.